afternoon, my friends. This is Paul, and today's video is all about body language. The type of thing that I've typically not been very good at, because usually body language is trying to convey some kind of emotion, and I'm not typically the best at reading other people's emotions if they're not like ridiculously specific about what it is they're feeling. However, one thing I am really good at is coming to conclusions, or at least guesses, about the state of something based on what my senses tell me. So I could look at, I don't know, the fireplace behind me and say, oh, that'll produce heat, or at least fake heat because it's a fake fireplace, and come to realizations based on my observations. So I thought it might be fun to look at the various functions of the Myers-Briggs system and talk about what I have observed in the body movements of the types that use those functions. Now, to speed things along from the last take that I did when I tried to describe this, well, more like the last couple of takes, because the previous one, the washing machine, was like pounding, so I didn't want that in the video. I am going to focus on how the functions play out in the dominant and secondary positions, because trying to explain it in all four, I feel like that would just drag this on too long, and these Myers-Briggs videos go on and on as it is. And I'll also edit in little blurbs saying which type uses it in which position. So, for example, when I talk about extroverted feeling, I'll be focusing on the EFJs and the IFJs, as opposed to trying to fit it into the ETPs, and yeah, that'll just be too complicated. So, without further ado, I always like to start with the perceiving functions because that is what I lead with myself. So we will start with introverted sensing. I haven't particularly been around a whole bunch of people that use introverted sensing in the top two positions. However, I am capable of observing myself and remembering actions that I have taken, as well as patterns for what actions I take when I'm around others. So I have noticed that for introverted sensing, it tends to come across as the person is very, very rarely in that moment in time. Like whenever an introverted sensor looks at something, it's almost as if they're like temporarily blind because they're not like focusing their attention on their immediate surroundings. Instead, they're comparing it to what they've seen before. That's why a lot of times I have trouble making eye contact, is because I'm like all of a sudden reminded of a memory and I'm like, oh, I see. And so there's a lot of information gathering going on that's very different to what the extroverted sensors do. So I would say that it's pretty easy to spot an introverted sensor, especially in the dominant, when they're constantly looking as though something else is catching their attention. To a certain extent, the INJs do that, but we'll get to that when we get to that. So just be aware of introverted sensors constantly looking as if something in the horizon is catching their attention, but their eye line doesn't match up what they're looking at, or if it does, ask them, what does this remind you of? And then if they have an immediate answer, then they're probably an ITJ or an IFJ. I said that wrong. It's an ISJ or ESJ question. Okay, gotta love the fact that we have those blurbs at the bottom after I film this. Next up, let's go into extroverted sensing. Now, extroverted sensors are a little bit more situational because extroverted sensing is a function that governs being in the moment and just completely being aware of everything going on in your five senses, not necessarily thinking about what could be or what has been, but just being totally in the now, especially when it's that high up on the function stack. So I have noticed that people with high extroverted sensing tend to have a gesture of openness, as if what they have just simply isn't enough, that they want more of it, that they just want to continue expanding, and just that maybe their body could be bigger so that they could experience more of it. So if they're, say, at a water park, they might be like reaching out for the water and like having this oh my gosh, gimme, 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 of I'm loving the water splashing on me. I'm loving the noise. Bring on the noise. And I guess these wide sweeping gestures also kind of fit. Very open to whatever is happening around them. They don't have that theorizing face that we ISJs do, so they're probably going to be more likely to, I guess, maybe sigh when it's all over, but then not think about it later because the next big thing is coming up. So next we move into the intuitive functions. We'll start with the introverted ones because that's always more fun. Introverted intuition is the hardest function for me to think about because it seems so bizarre to me to be able to plan that far ahead when the future is so uncertain. It's like, the Bible forbids fortune telling, and I'm pretty sure a lot of INJs that I know are also against fortune telling, but yet they seem so certain about how something is gonna happen. So, as far as how I can tell when they're future planning, they tend to do this like checklist type of thing with their hands, almost as if they're like mentally checking off these boxes of like, okay, we have to arrange this plan so that this happens. And it's almost like they're making a shopping list, but a shopping list for concepts as opposed to a shopping list for physical objects. I also think that introverted intuitives tend to have this zoned out type of look. Like their eye line focuses so directly on what it is that they're thinking about that they get like taken really off guard when you try to interrupt them from that train of thought. Like a lot of things I've noticed INTJs and INFJs in particular is, were you talking to me? Almost as if they're like, they can't even see what's all around them because they're so focused on one particular thing. And I think that's a result of inferior sensing that's actually for once being used, but because it's so weak, they're only able to hyper focus instead of focus on everything, like when sensing is higher up for the ESPs and ISPs. So definitely a great deal of focus, but a different kind of focus than the ISJs do. Next up we have extroverted intuition, which to some people seems like it's the same thing, but it's much more outward, much more tangential, and looking at external possibilities. It's really hard to explain because I'm an inferior intuitive myself, but I have been around enough ENFPs and one ENTP in my life, maybe two if I'm really stretching it. And one thing I've noticed about them is when they use their extroverted intuition, they have these really wide-eyed looks, almost as if they've been struck with a brilliant idea, and then they get this like mischievous smile of like, oh, let's see how far we can take this idea. So a combination of a mischievous smile plus wide open eyes, and oftentimes they have this like light bulb effect, like a eureka, I just had an idea. And it seems like that's just constantly happening. Like if I'm talking and all of a sudden something I said reminds them of an idea, they're just like, oh my gosh, I just thought of something. I admit I'm guilty of doing that too. But I feel like for me, it's a lot slower and less frequent. Whereas when it's that high up on the function stack, they do that all the time. Now it's time to move on to the judging functions. So we'll start out with introverted thinking. That's another function that I have a really hard time coming to terms with. Like, I feel like the thinking functions in general often get overshadowed by whatever feeling function the thinking type has. So when I've noticed people with higher up introverted thinking, especially ISTPs, because my gosh, I like to stay away from INTPs, they just bore me to death most of the time. I've noticed that when they use their introverted thinking, it's almost as if they purposely try to shut off their body language. Like it's almost like they're intentionally becoming stiff so that they are not emoting in the slightest, so that they can really focus on whatever it is they're trying to say or do. So if an ISTP is really intent on saying something, they're just not going to emote. And if you want to see a more emotive side, you have to put them in a situation where they're engaging their perceiving function. So if an ISTP, for example, is doing something fun, engaging their extroverted sensing, then you'll see more of what I just described with the extroverted sensing section, where they'll be like wanting more of it. But when it comes to like expressing their ideas, it almost comes across as if they're like putting up a defense. Like, this is my logic, this is my way of seeing the world, and if you try to cross me, you will not be able to get past me because I am right and you are wrong. Of course, they don't say it like that. Most introverted thinkers are not that confrontational like that. And if they are, it's mainly just because they're confident that what they have thought is the conclusion that has taken them so much time to get to. And how dare someone else question that motive because that person has inferior knowledge. I think when it's higher up in the function stack, they're usually a little bit better at explaining where their idea has come from. And because they're perceiving types, they don't have this edge to them that you would expect from the judging types. They sort of say like, well, if you can't agree with my solution, you're an idiot, but you have the right to be an idiot kind of thing. So I feel like that kind of makes me have a certain appreciation to the ITP and ETP types. Is sure, they're not always the most warm and friendly people, but at the same time they're also not very judgmental, but yet they also are. So like, I love the fact that they managed to toe the line between so many different personality traits. Next, let's move on to extroverted thinking. Basically, extroverted thinking is essentially this very like enforcing judge type of function. So like, you often see a lot of pointing, a lot of gesturing toward the individual that the person is talking to. And there's also a lot of like shrugging the shoulders and scoffing and like, well, that's obvious. And the thing about extroverted thinking is that it's much more pragmatic and concrete and step by step. So it's not so much an internal way of seeing the world, it's basing it off of what has been proven. Now, admittedly, there are some introverted thinkers that would try to claim that that's exactly what they do, but the way they word it is very different. Like, a lot of extroverted thinkers, not only do they think out loud more, so you get a lot of, I just had an idea, I am going to explain it whether you like it or not, but they also have a tendency to like quote sources even if the situation doesn't call for it. Like, if I am disapproving of, say, I don't know, say back in my old days where I was very, very anti-makeup, I would often say, like, you do realize that that'll just make you uglier when you get older, right? Because that's what the statistics say. It's not taking into account my own opinions at all. It's strictly going off of what I have researched. Now, whether I came to the right conclusion or not, well, I'll leave that up to the individual who knows how to research better than I do. But that's typically the kind of attitude you expect from extroverted thinkers, is like, are you stupid? Do you not understand how the world works? And just this like frustration at the slowness of others. Especially with the ETJs, they can get like this really angry, mean face, like, come on, hurry it up already. And they don't often like people to think about what they know about the world because, again, if it's already existing information, then they should know it. And if they don't, maybe they need their eyes checked. Maybe they need their ears checked. Like, how hard can it be to know that this wall is white? And then again, I might be colorblind, so maybe it's blue. You guys tell me in the comments. I'm not saying they're actually right with what they're saying, but I just think they could use a little bit of a humility pill. Now let's move on to something a little bit nicer, depending on if you cross them or not. Introverted feeling, which is a function that's used to govern ideas and personal values that mean something to the individual. So introverted feeling is kind of a paradoxical body language from what I have noticed, because introverted feelers, more than any other type, are like very aware of their own emotions, but everyone has emotions. Like, that's an automatic reaction in the brain. If you don't have emotions, then you're basically psychopathic or sociopathic. But for the introverted feelers, it's almost as if like their surroundings vanish and whatever emotion they have manifests itself in this artistic interpretation of whatever they're feeling. So if they're feeling sad, then I don't know, maybe there's like a bunch of raindrops falling around them in their imagination and their whole body is slumping. So I guess you could say there's a lot of exaggeration for those types. Like I've especially noticed this in the EFPs, where like if they're happy, they'll like be really happy and have these big wide smiles and happy eyebrows going up as high as they can, almost as if like they're just soaking in all of that emotion and nothing else around them matters. But here's where the paradoxical part comes in. Because it's introverted feeling, that means that it's highly subjective, not necessarily based on objective reality. So a lot of times what they feel is so much in their head that they also hold back at the same time. It's really hard to explain, but basically, and I know I said I would get into the tertiary here, I have introverted feeling as my third function. I'd like to think I've developed it so that I don't seem as robotic as most ISTJs, but for me, like usually when I'm experiencing a surge of emotion, I can't help but emote a little bit, but it often comes across as very not accurate to what's being said. So for example, if I'm upset about something, I might just like give a little smirk like that, or like look down and go like, huh, yeah. So it's oftentimes this like knee-jerk reaction, but with like the IFPs and the EFPs, it's like this explosion of emotion, whereas for me, it's more of like a tiny tick. So I would say it's pretty easy to tell when someone's an EFP or IFP when what they're feeling is both downplayed and exaggerated at the same time, if you can imagine that. So now let's get into extroverted feeling, the function that I'm pretty sure most of you watching this identify with to some degree. Extroverted feeling is basically it's looking at the emotions of the group and trying to think, how does everyone else feel? How do we create an environment that allows for as much harmony and positivity as possible? A lot of extroverted feelers also identify with being empaths, or at the very least, very empathetic. Not saying introverted feelers can't, but it's not going to override their own emotions. Whereas extroverted feelers can sometimes identify as emotion chameleons, where they absorb the energy of the crowd so much that it like takes over their own feelings that like get pushed aside because they say you're more important. So when extroverted feeling is in the top two functions, I have noticed that their body language tends to mirror whoever they're talking to. So if the person they're talking to is sad, then their facial expressions will get like very sad and like, oh no, I'm so sorry to hear that. If a person is happy, like I can't do it because I'm an introverted feeler, so I don't know how they do it, but it seems like extroverted feelers have bigger mouths. Like they tend to like really make their smiles go all the way up to their jawbones and just get this like big wide beaming grin like, oh my gosh, that is amazing. And again, introverted feelers do that too. But for the introverted feelers, they phrase it a little bit differently. Like they say, oh my gosh, you have made me so happy. I'm loving it. Whereas the extroverted feelers will often phrase it as, that's so wonderful. I'm sure you must be so happy about that. So it's the extroverted feelers are more about like all about you, whereas the introverted feelers are more like all about me. Again, they can balance, but priorities. Myers-Briggs is always about preferences. So extroverted feelers, they tend to look like they are mirrors of whatever is in front of them. But they also look like you have just completely drained the life force out of them if they absorb too much emotions. Like I've noticed some INFJs that look like they're like an inch away from death, where they're just like, my gosh, I am trying my hardest to make you so happy right now, but I am about to fall over. And it's almost as if they've like temporarily turned into an introverted feeler. So definitely try to watch out for that if you don't experience those high functions. So with that, I think I've covered all of them. I hope I didn't miss a secret ninth function. So let me know down in the comments if you have noticed anything about these functions, or like if you identify with any of the functions I have mentioned. Like, have I gotten it right, or do you think maybe my observations are more subjective? Either way, let me know in the comments. Anyway, before I go, I'd like to give an epic shout out to Matthew Rakowski, my first top tier patron on my Patreon page, and also a shout out to Sploon Ghost, Splatcat, and Scooter Doodle. Thank you so much for your support, guys, especially in this transition time of mine. It is a godsend that you guys are helping me out. If you guys want to join my Patreon, I'll leave a link in the description. So until the next time, keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless.